By the time the Apostle John sat down to write, 3 other accounts of Jesus' life were already circulating. Matthew had been read in synagogues turned churches for decades. Mark's short, urgent account had already reached Rome. Luke had already written his careful, orderly history for a Roman official named Theophilus. John had every reason to simply retell the same story once more, in his own words, for a new generation of readers who had never met anyone who walked with Jesus. Instead, he did something almost nobody expected. He left out most of it. No birth in a manger. No baptism in the Jordan. No 40 days tempted in the wilderness. No Sermon on the Mount, no parables about sowers and prodigal sons, no single demon cast out of a single tortured man. When he reaches the night before the crucifixion, he does not even record Jesus breaking bread and blessing wine. The words every church since has repeated at every communion table. Scholars have run the numbers. Roughly 90% of what is in John's Gospel appears nowhere else in the Bible. Not a slightly different version of the same story. Not present at all. So what was John doing? He was not filling in gaps the other 3 writers missed. He was writing an entirely different kind of book, built around a single, relentless purpose, one he states outright near the very end. And buried inside his Greek, almost invisible unless you go looking for it, is a choice so consistent it cannot be an accident. Across 21 chapters, John uses one particular verb 98 times. And he never once, not a single time, uses the noun that verb comes from. This is a study of the Gospel of John. Not what it repeats from the other 3 Gospels, because it repeats almost nothing. What it builds instead, word by word, sign by sign, until the very grammar of the book becomes part of its argument. Start with what is missing, because John's omissions are not accidents of memory. They are decisions. There is no genealogy tracing Jesus back through David and Abraham, the way Matthew opens his account. There is no manger, no shepherds, no wise men following a star. John skips Jesus' baptism in the Jordan River entirely, along with the dove and the voice from heaven that the other 3 Gospels all record. There is no wilderness temptation, no 40 days fasting while the devil offers bread and kingdoms. There is no Sermon on the Mount, no Lord's Prayer taught to the disciples. And most strikingly for a Jewish rabbi whose entire teaching method, in the other Gospels, runs on parables, John records not one single story parable in the way Matthew, Mark, and Luke use the term. No sower scattering seed. No prodigal son walking home. No good Samaritan on the road to Jericho. John also removes every exorcism. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus casts demons out of tortured, screaming people again and again, and it becomes one of the clearest public signs of his authority. In John, this simply never happens. And then there is the detail that startles people most. At the Last Supper, John spends more space than any other gospel writer describing that final evening, 4 full chapters of dialogue. And in all 4 chapters, Jesus never once takes the bread and says, "This is my body." He never lifts the cup and says, "This is my blood." The words every church since has repeated at every communion service are simply absent from John's account of that night. In their place, John gives us something no other gospel includes at all. Jesus, on his knees, washing his disciples' feet like a household servant. Why would a writer leave out the very words most Christians would consider essential to remember? The most likely answer is the simplest one. John was not writing to preserve facts that might otherwise be forgotten. Matthew, Mark, and Luke had already done that job, and done it well, and their accounts were already being read aloud in churches by the time John picked up his pen. John was writing to explain what all of it had meant. Ancient tradition places John's Gospel last among the 4, written near the end of the 1st century. Likely from the city of Ephesus, decades after the events themselves and possibly decades after the other three Gospels were already in wide circulation. By then, the eyewitnesses were dying. The questions people were asking about Jesus had changed. They no longer needed another account of what happened. They needed someone to tell them what it meant, and who, exactly, this man had actually been. So instead of retelling, John reaches for something almost nobody else in the New Testament attempts. He opens his gospel not in Bethlehem, and not even at Jesus' baptism, but before the beginning of time itself. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Any Jewish reader in the first century would recognize those first three words instantly. In the beginning, are the exact opening words of the book of Genesis, in the same Greek translation Jewish readers across the empire used every week in synagogue. John is not simply starting his book. He is rewriting the opening line of the entire Hebrew Bible. And placing Jesus inside it, before Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 has even finished being said. The Greek word John chooses for word is logos. It is a carefully chosen word, doing at least two jobs at once. To a Jewish reader, logos would call to mind the wisdom literature of the Old Testament, where God's wisdom is described as present with him before creation, taking part in the forming of the world. To a Greek-speaking reader trained in philosophy, logos was already a loaded term, the rational principle believed to structure and hold together the entire universe. John takes both meanings and points them at a single person. Not an abstract principle. Not a poetic metaphor for wisdom. A person, present at creation, who was somehow both distinct from God and, in the same breath, described as God himself. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. This is theology moving at the speed of poetry. In 3 short verses, John has claimed that the man his readers know stories about, the one who got tired on a well's edge and wept at a friend's tomb, was also present, actively creating, before a single star existed. Then, in verse 14, comes the turn that changes everything that came before it. And the Word was made flesh, and dwelt among us. And we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. The eternal, creating Word did not simply visit the world from a safe distance. He became flesh. The Greek word John uses for dwelt literally means to pitch a tent, the same image used throughout the Old Testament for God's presence dwelling among Israel in the wilderness tabernacle. John is telling his readers, in a single verb, that the God who once dwelt in a tent of animal skins in the desert has now pitched his tent in a human body. This is why John can skip the manger entirely. He has already told his readers something far larger than a birth story. Before Bethlehem, before Nazareth, before any of it, there was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word chose to become one of us. Everything else in the Gospel, every sign, every discourse, every conversation, will simply unfold what that opening claim already means. John performs a strange bit of restraint with his vocabulary. Where the other Gospels freely use the Greek word for miracle or act of power, John almost never does. His preferred word is semeion. A sign. A sign, by definition, points beyond itself. Nobody parks their car to admire a highway exit sign. You read it, and you look toward the exit it is pointing to. John selects exactly 7 of Jesus's miracles, out of what he says were many more, and calls them signs specifically because he does not want his readers staring at the miracle itself. He wants them looking through it, toward the identity it reveals. The first sign happens at a wedding in the village of Cana. The wine has run out. An embarrassment that could shame a family for years in that culture. Jesus tells the servants to fill 6 massive stone jars with water, water meant for Jewish ceremonial washing. And when it is drawn out, it has become wine, and not cheap wine either. The best wine of the night, saved for last. John tells us plainly what this sign accomplished. This beginning of signs did Jesus, and manifested forth his glory, and his disciples believed on him. The old system of ceremonial washing, John is suggesting, is being quietly replaced by something new, and abundant, and better than what came before it. The second sign takes place at a distance. A royal official's son lies dying in Capernaum. The man begs Jesus to come. Jesus does not go anywhere. He simply says, "Go thy way, thy son liveth," and the boy is healed. In that exact hour, miles away. The sign is about the sheer authority carried in Jesus' spoken word alone. The third sign happens at the pool of Bethesda, where a man has been paralyzed for 38 years. Jesus heals him with a single command to stand and walk, and does it on the Sabbath. Deliberately provoking the religious authorities who policed Sabbath rest with elaborate rules. The fourth sign, the feeding of 5,000 people from 5 loaves and 2 fish, becomes the platform for one of Jesus' most direct claims about himself, which the next part of this study will look at closely. The fifth sign, walking across the surface of a storm-tossed sea to reach his disciples' boat, demonstrates authority over creation itself, the same authority claimed for the word in John's opening chapter. The sixth sign is the healing of a man born blind, not blinded later in life, but blind from birth, so that no one could claim it was some passing ailment cured by chance. Jesus performs this healing, again, on the Sabbath, and the resulting controversy takes up an entire chapter of the Gospel. The seventh and final sign is the largest of all. In the village of Bethany, Jesus stands before the sealed tomb of his friend Lazarus, for days dead, and calls him back out into the world of the living. This sign does not merely point toward Jesus' identity. It becomes the final provocation that convinces the religious authorities he must be killed. 7 signs, rising in scale from turning water into wine at a village wedding, to calling a dead man out of his own tomb. John tells us exactly why he selected these particular 7, out of everything else Jesus did. These are written, that ye might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing ye might have life through his name. Every sign is a door. John never wants his readers standing at the door admiring its craftsmanship. He wants them walking through it. Notice, too, the shape of the progression. John did not simply list 7 miracles in the order they happened and call it a day. He selected these 7, out of what he explicitly says were many more, because together they climb. Water becomes wine, a small domestic embarrassment quietly solved. A dying boy is healed from a distance. A man paralyzed for nearly 4 decades stands and walks. Thousands are fed from almost nothing. A storm-tossed sea is walked across like dry ground. A man blind since the day he was born receives sight he has never once had. And finally, a man 4 days dead, already decaying in a sealed tomb, is called back into life by name. Each sign reaches further than the one before it, until the final sign reaches all the way into death itself. By the time a reader arrives at Lazarus's tomb, they have already been shown, one deliberate step at a time, that nothing in creation sits outside the authority of the man performing these signs. Woven between the 7 signs are 7 statements Jesus makes about his own identity, each one beginning with the same 2 words. And each one drawing directly from a moment centuries earlier, when God first spoke his own name to a man standing in front of a burning bush. When Moses asked God what name he should give the Israelites in Egypt, God's answer was startling in its simplicity. I am that I am. Not a name borrowed from nature or mythology. Simply, absolute existence itself, speaking its own name. Centuries later, in the Gospel of John, Jesus takes that same phrase, in the same Greek construction used to translate God's words to Moses, and applies it directly to himself, 7 separate times. I am the bread of life, he says, the day after feeding 5,000 people with 5 loaves. Their ancestors ate manna in the wilderness and still died. Jesus offers a different kind of bread. One that ends hunger permanently rather than for a single day. I am the light of the world, he says, during a festival where a massive candelabra lit the temple courts each night. As a reminder of the pillar of fire that once guided Israel through the wilderness. Jesus takes that image of guiding light and quietly claims it for himself. I am the door of the sheep, and shortly after, I am the good shepherd. Both images draw on an old prophetic complaint, that Israel's leaders had become false shepherds, scattering and neglecting the flock entrusted to them. Jesus claims to be the door those sheep can safely pass through, and the shepherd who lays down his own life for them, rather than fleeing when danger comes. I am the resurrection and the life, he tells a grieving woman named Martha, standing outside her brother's tomb, moments before he calls Lazarus back into the world of the living. This is not a statement about a future resurrection at the end of history. Jesus places resurrection and life inside his own present identity. I am the way, the truth, and the life, he tells his disciples on the night before his death, when they ask how they could possibly know the way to wherever he is going. Not a way among several options. The way, singular, exclusive, and personal. I am the true vine, he says in his final extended teaching before his arrest. Describing the branches that draw their life from staying connected to him, and wither the moment they are cut off. 7 statements, each one metaphorical, each one pointing toward some part of what Jesus offers. But John saves one final, I am, for a moment that is not metaphorical at all. Arguing with religious leaders who prided themselves on their descent from Abraham, Jesus tells them plainly. Before Abraham was, I am. Not, I was. Not even, I existed before him. I am, present tense, timeless, the exact phrase spoken from the burning bush. The crowd's response tells you they understood precisely what he was claiming. They picked up stones to kill him on the spot for blasphemy. 7 metaphors, and one bare, unshielded claim to the divine name itself. By the time a careful reader reaches the end of John's Gospel, I am has stopped sounding like a grammatical convenience and started sounding like a signature. If John removes the crowd-facing parables of the other Gospels, he replaces them with something the other 3 barely attempt. Long, unhurried, one-on-one conversations, where we watch a single person's understanding shift in real time. Nicodemus comes to Jesus at night, a respected religious teacher, careful enough to avoid being seen, visiting this controversial rabbi in daylight. Jesus tells him he must be born again, born of water and the Spirit, and Nicodemus, a man who has spent his life mastering the Hebrew Scriptures, is completely lost. How can a man be born when he is old, he asks, taking the metaphor literally, unable yet to hear it any other way. John lets us sit inside that confusion rather than rushing past it. We watch a brilliant, sincere man fail to understand, in real time. Because understanding Jesus was never simply a matter of intelligence. Nicodemus does not reappear in a single dramatic conversion scene. He surfaces twice more, quietly, cautiously. Later in the Gospel, once defending Jesus' right to a fair hearing before his fellow religious leaders. And finally at the very end, bringing an extravagant weight of burial spices for Jesus' body after the crucifixion. John never tells us exactly when belief took hold in him. He simply lets us watch it grow, scene by scene, across the entire book. Then there is the woman John's Gospel meets at a well outside a Samaritan village at noon. The hour she chose specifically to avoid the other women who would otherwise gather water in the cool of morning. and gossip about her string of failed marriages. A Jewish rabbi should not have spoken to her at all. Jewish and Samaritan communities despised each other. And a man was not supposed to speak alone with a woman in public. Jesus asks her for a drink of water. What follows is the longest single conversation Jesus has with anyone in any of the four Gospels. Longer than any exchange with his own disciples. He tells her about living water that ends thirst forever. She tests him, deflects him, and eventually asks him a real theological question about where God should properly be worshipped. And Jesus answers her, fully, seriously, as though she were exactly the kind of person worth a real theological conversation. By the end of it, she leaves her water jar sitting at the well, forgotten, and runs back to the very village she had been avoiding, to tell people about the man who told her everything she had ever done. John did not need a parable about a lost coin swept out from under a cabinet to make his point about seeking what was overlooked. He simply let his readers sit at a well, in real time, and watch it happen to an actual person. With an actual name nobody bothered to record, in a village most respectable people would not have entered. Put Nicodemus and the woman at the well side by side and the method becomes clear. One is a respected male religious insider who comes to Jesus carefully, at night, and still leaves confused. The other is an anonymous, 5 times divorced woman from a despised community who comes to a well at noon simply to avoid other people. And leaves as the first evangelist in the entire gospel, running to tell an entire village about the man at the well. John did not choose these two conversations by accident. He placed the most respectable insider and the least respectable outsider back to back, on purpose. So that no reader could mistake his message for one aimed only at people who already belonged. Here, finally, is the detail hidden in John's actual Greek that ties the entire gospel together. Across 21 chapters, the Greek verb pisteuo, meaning, to believe, appears 98 times. That is nearly 40% of every single use of that verb in the entire New Testament. Concentrated inside one relatively short book. And in all 98 uses, John never once reaches for the matching noun. Pistis, the Greek word for faith itself, does not appear a single time in his gospel. Not once, across 21 chapters built almost entirely around the theme of belief. This is not an accident of vocabulary. Every other author across the New Testament uses the noun freely. Paul uses it well over 100 times. It would have been the easiest, most natural word in the world for John to reach for. He consistently, deliberately, does not. A noun names a thing you can possess, examine, and set down somewhere. You can have faith the way you have a coin in your pocket. A verb names something you are actively doing, right now, and only for as long as you keep doing it. By refusing the noun and clinging to the verb, 98 separate times, John is making an argument with his grammar that runs underneath every sign and every "I am" statement in the entire book. Believing, for John, was never a possession you acquire once. It was a continuous act, closer to trusting, or entrusting yourself, moment by moment. To the person these 7 signs and 7 statements have been pointing toward all along. This is why John's Gospel does not end with the resurrection itself, the way a reader might expect. It ends with 2 more scenes that complete the thought. On the night of his arrest, in the longest single block of teaching in the book, Jesus tells his disciples he is leaving, and promises to send what he calls the Paraclete. A Greek legal term meaning something close to advocate, or helper, one called alongside you. This promised Spirit will not simply comfort the disciples after Jesus is gone. He will actively teach them, remind them, and continue the ongoing act of believing long after the last sign has been performed. And Jesus himself has physically left the room. And then, after the resurrection, Jesus appears to a disciple named Thomas, who had refused to believe. The others report until he could touch the wounds himself. Jesus lets him. And Thomas responds with the single highest confession of Jesus' identity anywhere in the Gospel, "My Lord and my God." Immediately after that scene, John steps out from behind his narrative entirely and speaks directly to his reader, explaining, in his own voice, exactly why he selected these 7 signs and these 7 statements out of everything else he could have written. And many other signs truly did Jesus in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written, that ye might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing ye might have life through his name. There it is again. Not the noun. The verb, one final time, at the very hinge of the entire book. John did not write to give his readers one more set of facts to file away alongside what Matthew, Mark, and Luke had already recorded. He wrote a book built, sentence by sentence, sign by sign, to move that single verb out of the page and into the actual, ongoing life of whoever was reading it. "90% of what John wrote appears nowhere else in the Bible, because John was never trying to repeat what 3 other writers had already told well. He was explaining what it meant, starting not at a manger but before the first morning of creation. Tracing 7 chosen signs from a wedding spare wine to a friend's open tomb. Letting 7, I am, statements echo a name first spoken from a burning bush. And underneath all of it, in a choice so quiet most readers never notice it at all. He built his entire gospel around a verb he refused to let harden into a noun. Not something you have. Something you do, continuously, the way a hand keeps reaching rather than closing once around what it has already grasped. These are written, that ye might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing ye might have life through his name. 98 times, John chose the verb. He is still asking his readers, this many centuries later, to choose it too.